The summer rain hammered the corrugated metal roof of the 2nd Armoured Division Repair Depot, 3 miles behind the Normandy front lines. It was July 18th, 1944, 42 days after D-Day, and Sergeant Frank "Wrench" Kowalski stood beside the burned-out hulk of Sherman Tank No. 3, a 7, staring at a hole that shouldn't exist. The penetration measured exactly 3.2 inches in diameter, clean, surgical, devastating. This was the 7th Sherman that week with the same fatal wound. Not from the feared German 88mm anti-tank gun those left holes you could crawl through. No, this was something worse, something new, something that turned American tanks into coffins with a single shot from close range, the Panzerfaust. Kowalski ran his welding-scarred fingers around the entry hole in the Sherman's side armor. The metal was 2 inches thick at this point, rolled homogeneous steel, supposedly sufficient to stop most German anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. The Sherman's frontal armor was even thicker, nearly 3 inches in places, but thickness didn't matter against shaped charges. "Another one, Sarge?" Private Eddie Morrison appeared beside him, rain streaming off his helmet. The kid was 19, from Iowa, and had been in France for exactly 11 days. He still flinched at distant artillery. "Yeah, Panzerfaust, close range, probably under 50 yards. Went straight through the sponson, killed the bow gunner and driver instantly. Ammunition cooked off about 90 seconds later. Only the loader got out, and he died at the field hospital last night." Morrison swallowed hard. "That's 5 guys, Sarge." "5 guys from 1 tank," Kowalski corrected. "Multiply that by every Sherman hit by these things. Do the math, Private. We're losing entire crews faster than we can replace them." The mathematics of tank warfare in Normandy were brutal and getting worse. The U.S. Army had landed approximately 1,000 Sherman tanks in the first weeks after D-Day. By mid-July, nearly 400 had been knocked out. The replacement rate kept pace barely, but the crew replacement rate didn't. Tank crews who survived one knockout often refused to crew another Sherman. They called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up on the first strike. Others called them Tommy Cookers. The Germans had their own nickname, Blechsärge, tin coffins. The problem wasn't the Sherman's engine or transmission or gun. The 75mm cannon could handle most German tanks at reasonable ranges. The problem was survivability against modern anti-tank weapons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The German Panzerfaust was a disposable, single-shot rocket launcher that fired a shaped charge warhead. The technology was devastatingly simple and horrifyingly effective. When the warhead struck armor, the shaped charge focused explosive energy into a superheated jet of metal plasma that could penetrate several inches of steel armor. Thickness didn't help. Angle didn't help much either. The plasma jet burned through like a blowtorch through butter, creating a narrow penetration hole that injected metal fragments and superheated gas into the tank's interior. What happened next was predictable. Ammunition, detonation, fuel fire, crew death. The Panzerfaust had a maximum effective range of about 60 yards, but German infantry had learned to wait until Shermans came much closer, often within 30 yards before firing. At that range, even poorly trained soldiers rarely missed. Kowalski had seen the pattern repeated across dozens of knocked-out Shermans. German infantry would hide in the dense Normandy hedgerows, wait for American tanks to advance along the narrow roads, then hit them from the side at point-blank range. The side armor was the weakest point, only 1.5 to 2 inches thick compared to 3 inches on the front. 1 shot. 1 kill. Move to the next hedgerow. The tactical situation in Normandy made it worse. The Bocage country ancient hedgerow-divided farmland created a nightmare for armor operations. Roads were sunken lanes barely wide enough for a single tank. Fields were small and surrounded by earthen berms topped with thick vegetation. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Shermans couldn't maneuver, couldn't use their speed advantage. couldn't maintain safe standoff distances. They had to advance slowly down predictable routes, perfect targets for ambush, and the Germans were very, very good at ambushes. Kowalski had been with the 2nd Armoured Division since North Africa. He'd fought through Sicily and Italy before landing in Normandy on D+3. In 2 years of combat, he'd seen American tank design evolve better engines, improved transmissions, upgraded guns, but armour protection had barely changed. The Sherman still relied on rolled homogeneous steel armour of moderate thickness. It was good enough against most German anti-tank guns at medium range. It was completely inadequate against shaped charges at close range. The problem was well known. Reports from the Eastern Front had described Soviet tanks being destroyed by German handheld anti-tank weapons. American intelligence knew the Panzerfaust existed months before D-Day, but knowing about a problem and solving it were different things. The Army's solution was to produce more Shermans. If tanks were being destroyed faster than expected, build more tanks, ship them to France, replace losses, keep the offensive moving forward. This approach worked from a strategic perspective. American industrial capacity could replace tank losses indefinitely. German industrial capacity couldn't. Eventually, through sheer attrition, America would win. But Kowalski wasn't thinking strategically. He was thinking about the 5 men who'd burned to death inside Sherman 3A7. He was thinking about the hundreds of other crews who'd died the same way. He was thinking about the terrified replacement crews arriving daily, knowing their odds of survival were barely 50-50. There had to be a better way. The official solution from Army Ordnance was already in development: thicker armour on new production models. The Sherman M4A3E2, nicknamed the Jumbo, mounted frontal armour up to 4 inches thick and side armour up to 3 inches thick. It could shrug off most German anti-tank weapons, but the Jumbo wouldn't arrive in numbers until late 1944 or early 1945. The tanks currently in Normandy, the tanks dying every day, were standard production models with standard armour. Crews needed protection now, not 6 months from now. Some units tried improvising their own solutions. Crews welded spare track links to their tank hulls, creating makeshift additional armour. Others sandbagged the floors to protect against mines. A few enterprising crews welded scrap metal plates to vulnerable spots. None of it worked against Panzerfausts. The problem was the physics of shaped charges. Additional thickness just meant the plasma jet had to penetrate a bit farther, and it could penetrate up to 8 inches of steel. Adding an inch or two of scrap metal accomplished nothing. Kowalski had read the intelligence reports. He understood the shaped charge mechanism. He'd studied the penetration holes in dozens of knocked-out Shermans, and he'd been thinking about a solution for 3 weeks. The idea had come to him while watching a demonstration of German weapons captured during the advance. An intelligence officer explained how the Panzerfaust worked. The shaped charge had to detonate at a precise standoff distance from the target armour to focus the explosive jet properly. Too close, and the jet didn't form correctly. Too far, and the jet dispersed before penetrating. The optimal standoff distance was about 6 to 8 inches. That was the key. That was the vulnerability. What if you didn't try to stop the warhead? What if you just prevented it from detonating at the correct distance? Kowalski's idea was simple. Create a standoff barrier several inches away from the Sherman's actual armour. Something cheap, light, and quick to install. Something that would trigger the Panzerfaust warhead prematurely before it reached optimal standoff distance. The plasma jet would still form, but it would form too far from the actual armour. By the time it reached the Sherman's hull, the jet would have dispersed and lost penetrating power. The tank's standard armour could then stop what remained. He'd sketched the concept in his notebook 2 weeks ago, a framework of vertical steel posts welded to the tank hull, spaced 8 to 10 inches away from the armour. Horizontal steel bars or mesh connecting the posts, creating a cage-like structure around the tank. The standoff armour wouldn't stop the warhead from exploding, it would just trigger it prematurely. The explosion would waste itself against empty air, and the Sherman's own armour would handle the weakened plasma jet. The concept was sound, the physics checked out. The materials were available salvage yards behind the lines overflowed with scrap steel from destroyed vehicles. But when Kowalski had pitched the idea to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, 3 days ago, the response had been immediate and dismissive. "Sergeant, that's the stupidest thing I've heard all week. You want to weld a cage around our tanks? Make them look like circus wagons? Add weight, reduce visibility, create maintenance nightmares?" "Sir, the math works. If we can trigger the shaped charge 8 or 10 inches away from the hull—" "The math works," Harrison interrupted, "in your notebook. In reality, you're talking about field modifications to combat vehicles using salvage materials and untested welding techniques. What happens when your cage breaks loose during combat? What happens when it interferes with turret traverse? What happens when crews can't bail out because they're trapped inside your cage?" "Sir, those are engineering problems we can solve, but crews can't bail out of burning tanks either, and that's happening right now." Harrison's expression had softened slightly. "Kowalski, I understand you're trying to help, but this division has procedures for equipment modifications. You submit a proposal through proper channels. Engineers evaluate it. Ordnance tests prototypes. That process takes months. We don't have months, sir. We're losing tanks every day." "Then we'll replace them every day. That's what America does. We outproduce the enemy. Your job is to repair damaged tanks and keep the ones we have running. Leave the armor design to the people who actually know what they're doing." Kowalski had left that meeting frustrated and angry. Not because Harrison was a bad officer, he wasn't. Harrison cared about his men and wanted them to survive. But he was trapped by institutional thinking, by procedures, by the assumption that official channels knew best. The same assumption had probably gotten 100 men killed in the past week alone. Standing now beside Sherman, 3 or 7 inches the rain, staring at the hole that had killed 5 more Americans, Kowalski made a decision. Screw proper channels. He'd build a prototype himself, prove the concept worked. Then they'd have to listen. "Morrison?" he called to the private, who was examining another knocked-out tank nearby. "Get your ass over here. We've got work to do." "What kind of work, Sarge?" Kowalski smiled for the first time in days. "The kind that gets us court-martialed or decorated. Could go either way." The repair depot operated 24 hours a day, but the night shift between 0200 and 0600 was the quietest. Most welding and heavy repair happened during daylight. Night work focused on maintenance, parts inventory, and preparing damaged tanks for morning repairs. This made it the perfect time for unauthorized experiments. Kowalski had carefully selected his co-conspirators. Private Morrison was in because he'd already seen the conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and understood what was at stake. Corporal Jimmy Sparks DeLuca joined because he was the best welder in the depot and owed Kowalski a favor from Sicily. Sergeant Ben Washington signed on because he'd lost his brother, a Sherman driver, to a Panzerfaust 2 weeks earlier. 4 men, 1 night, 1 chance to prove a concept. Their test subject was Sherman Tank No. 2, C-12, damaged by an 88mm hit that had destroyed the transmission but left the hull intact. The tank was scheduled for parts salvage, perfect for their purposes. If they screwed up, they'd just be cannibalizing a tank that was already written off. The salvage yard behind the depot contained everything they needed. Destroyed German vehicles yielded steel bars and brackets. Knocked out American tanks provided angle iron and support posts. A burned-out half-track contributed its roll cage framework. Kowalski had refined his design over the past 3 days. The standoff barrier would consist of vertical steel posts, 12 inches long, welded to the tank hull every 18 inches. Horizontal bars would connect the posts, creating a grid framework. The entire structure would stand 10 inches away from the Sherman's actual armor. Critical design requirements. First, the standoff distance had to be at least 8 inches to force Panzerfaust warheads to detonate prematurely. 10 inches provided a safety margin. Second, the framework had to be strong enough to reliably trigger incoming warheads, but light enough not to significantly increase the tank's weight. Third, the cage couldn't interfere with turret rotation, driver vision, or emergency egress. Fourth, it had to be quick to install 5 hours maximum using standard welding equipment and readily available materials. The physics were straightforward. The Panzerfaust's shaped charge required precise standoff distance to function optimally. The warhead's contact fuse would detonate as soon as it struck any solid object. If that object was 10 inches away from the target armor, the plasma jet would form and propagate through empty air, losing energy and coherence before reaching the actual hull. Testing shaped charges wasn't possible at a repair depot. They didn't have access to Panzerfaust warheads or proper testing facilities. But Kowalski had studied enough knocked-out tanks to understand the penetration mechanics. He'd measured dozens of Panzerfaust impact points, noting angles, penetration depths, and internal damage patterns. His calculations suggested that triggering the warhead even 6 inches early would reduce penetration depth by at least 40%. At 10 inches early, reduction might exceed 60%. The Sherman's standard 2-inch side armor should be sufficient to stop a 60% weakened plasma jet. Should be. Probably. Maybe. The only way to know for certain was to test it in combat. But first, they had to build it. All right, listen up. Kowalski addressed his team at 0215 hours. They stood in the darkest corner of the salvage yard, far from the main depot lights. We've got 4 hours before the day shift arrives. Here's how this works. He unfolded his sketches on the hood of a jeep, using a flashlight to illuminate the drawings. We're building a cage framework around the tank hull. Vertical posts first, welded directly to the hull armor. Posts are 12 inches long, made from 1-inch square steel tube. We position them every 18 inches around the entire hull perimeter sides, front and rear. Not the top? Morrison asked. Panzerfausts are infantry weapons, fired from ground level. Nobody's shooting at us from above. Top armor stays clear so the turret can rotate freely. What about the tracks? DeLuca questioned. Tracks stay exposed. We need ground clearance, and we can't interfere with track operation. The cage starts just above track level and extends up to the top of the hull, just below the turret ring. Washington studied the drawings. How many posts total? Kowalski had done the math. Approximately 60 posts for full hull coverage. Each post weighs about 2 pounds. That's 120 pounds of vertical posts. Add another 80 pounds for horizontal connecting bars. Total additional weight around 200 pounds. The Sherman weighs 30 tons, Washington observed. 200 pounds is less than 1% increase. Won't affect performance. Exactly. Now, horizontal bars connect the posts, creating a grid pattern. We're using 1/2-inch steel bar stock, running both vertically and horizontally between posts. Creates a mesh that'll stop any Panzerfaust warhead from reaching the hull without hitting the framework first. What about vision ports? Morrison asked. Driver needs to see. Vision ports stay clear. We build the cage around them, not over them. Same with hatches. We need clear egress paths. The cage protects the flat armor panels, where Panzerfausts usually hit. DeLuca picked up one of the salvaged steel tubes they'd collected. These welds need to be solid, Sarge. If a post breaks loose during combat and wedges in the tracks, you've got a mobility kill. Which is why you're doing the welding, Sparks. I've seen your work. You could weld a battleship together with a car battery and a coat hanger. The corporal grinned. Flattery noted. But seriously, we need proper penetration welds. These posts have to stay attached even if the tank hits rough terrain at speed. Agreed. That's why we're using full penetration butt welds at every post base. Grind the armor surface clean first, get good contact, and lay down proper beads. They worked in near darkness, using minimal lighting to avoid attracting attention. The tank sat in the salvage yard's far corner, partially hidden behind a burned-out half-track. Anyone glancing in their direction would see only shadows and occasional welding flashes. Nothing unusual for a depot that operated around the clock. Washington and Morrison began by measuring and marking post positions on the tank hull. They used a tape measure and chalk, carefully spacing the marks every 18 inches around the entire perimeter. Front hull, side sponsons, rear plate, every flat surface received marks. While they measured, Kowalski and DeLuca cut steel tube stock into 12-inch lengths using a portable bandsaw. The salvaged steel varied in condition. Some pieces were straight and clean, others slightly bent or rusty. They selected the best pieces for the most critical positions and set aside the marginal material for less stressed locations. "How'd you come up with 10 inches, Sarge?" DeLuca asked as they cut. "Intelligence reports on Panzerfaust effective range. The shaped charge works best at about 6 inches standoff. Too close and the jet doesn't form right. Too far and it disperses. So we need to trigger it farther than 6 inches. 8 would probably work, but 10 gives us safety margin." "You really think this'll stop an 88mm Panzerfaust?" "No," Kowalski said flatly. "Won't stop it. We'll just make it detonate early. The Sherman's own armor stops what's left." "And if your calculations are wrong?" Kowalski met his eyes. "Then we've wasted one night building a fancy cage, and crews keep dying. But if I'm right, we might save a lot of lives." DeLuca nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Let's make sure these welds are perfect." By 0300 hours, they had 60 posts cut and ready. Washington had finished marking positions on the hull. Time to start welding. DeLuca set up his welding rig, a gasoline-powered generator connected to a Lincoln arc welder. Not subtle, but the depot's background noise would mask the sound. He selected 3 32-inch welding rods, checked his ground clamp connection, and tested the arc on a scrap piece. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The welds had to be perfect. Too weak and posts would break off during combat. Too much heat, and they'd warp the tank's armor. DeLuca knew his craft. He'd been welding since he was 14, working in his father's Pittsburgh steel fabrication shop. The army had recognized his skill and assigned him to armored maintenance instead of infantry. "Starting front left corner," he announced, pulling down his welding hood. The arc struck with a sharp crack and a brilliant blue-white flare. Molten metal flowed, fusing the first post to the Sherman's hull. DeLuca worked steadily, methodically, creating strong full-penetration welds at each post base. While DeLuca welded posts, the others prepared horizontal connecting bars. These were simpler, straight lengths of half-inch steel bar, cut to span the distance between posts. Kowalski had designed a simple clip system. Small brackets welded to each post would hold the horizontal bars in place. "This is actually pretty clever," Morrison observed as he fitted test bars between 2 posts. "The whole thing is modular. If we damage a section, we can remove that piece and replace it without tearing apart the whole cage." "That's the idea, Private. Field repairability matters. We can't ship tanks back to depot every time something breaks." By 0430 hours, all 60 vertical posts were welded in place. The Sherman now bristled with steel tubes protruding 12 inches from its hull. It looked bizarre, like a porcupine or a medieval Iron Maiden, but the posts were solid, strong, and positioned exactly right. Now came the horizontal bars. This went faster. DeLuca welded small brackets to each post. Morrison and Washington fitted bars between brackets, creating horizontal runs around the entire hull perimeter. Kowalski followed behind, checking connections and marking spots that needed reinforcement. The emerging pattern looked like a combination of prison bars and an industrial safety cage. The spacing was tight enough that no Panzerfaust warhead could slip through without striking the framework, but open enough that crews could still see out and bail out if necessary. At 0545, 15 minutes before the day shift arrived, they finished the last connection. The 4 men stood back and examined their work. Sherman 2C12 no longer looked like a standard tank. The standoff cage transformed its appearance completely. It looked strange, improvised, almost comical, like someone had tried to build a tank inside a jungle gym. But it also looked protective. The dense framework of steel posts and bars created an obvious barrier between the outside world and the tank's vulnerable hull. "Think it'll work?" Morrison asked quietly. Kowalski walked slowly around the tank, examining welds, checking clearances, testing post strength. Everything looked solid. The engineering was sound. The materials were adequate. The execution was excellent. "Only one way to find out," he finally said. "How?" Washington asked. "We can't exactly test-fire a Panzerfaust at it here." "No. But we can get it to the front line and see what happens in actual combat." DeLuca pulled off his welding gloves. "Sarge, you're talking about putting an untested modification on a combat vehicle and sending it into action. If it fails, crews die. If it interferes with tank operation, crews die. If Colonel Harrison finds out you did this without authorization, you get court-martialed." "All true," Kowalski agreed, "which is why we're going to volunteer to crew it ourselves." The three other men stared at him. "You're serious," Morrison said slowly. "Dead serious, Private. I'm not asking some other crew to test my theory. We built it. We crew it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, at least we'll know." "Sarge, I'm a welder, not a tanker," DeLuca protested. "You can learn. Morrison here was a farm kid 11 days ago. Now he's supposedly qualified to operate a 30-ton fighting vehicle. How hard can it be?" "That's insane," Washington said. Then he smiled. "I'm in. Let me drive. I've always wanted to drive a tank." "I'll take bow gunner," Morrison added. "Might as well see this through." DeLuca shook his head, grinning despite himself. "Command me to be loader. Somebody's got to keep you three idiots alive." Kowalski clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Now, we just need to figure out how to get this tank to the front line without anyone noticing it looks like we built it inside a birdcage." As dawn broke over the repair depot, the day shift began arriving. The four conspirators cleaned up their work area, stowing tools and sweeping away welding debris. Sherman 2C12 sat in the corner of the salvage yard, barely visible in the early morning shadows. To a casual observer, it looked like just another damaged tank awaiting parts salvage. But Frank Kowalski knew better. That strange-looking Sherman with its improvised standoff cage represented something revolutionary. If it worked. If it didn't, well, at least they'd tried something. Which was more than official channels had done. Getting an unauthorized prototype combat vehicle from the repair depot to the front line required creative paperwork, selective truth-telling, and one remarkably convenient coincidence. The coincidence arrived at 0930 hours, on July 19th, in the form of an urgent request from 3rd Battalion, 66th Armoured Regiment. They'd lost 2 Shermans in a dawn engagement near Saint-Lô and desperately needed immediate replacements. The request specified any operational M4 variants, combat ready, delivered by 1600 hours today. Kowalski saw the requisition and saw opportunity. Sherman 2C12 had a destroyed transmission but an intact hull, turret, gun, engine, and most other systems. The transmission swap would take 3 hours routine work for an experienced crew. By 1400 hours, the tank would be mechanically operational. The question was whether anyone would notice or care that this particular Sherman now wore an unusual external modification. "Morrison, fire up the parts inventory," Kowalski ordered. "Find me a transmission from any scrapped Sherman that matches 2C12's model." "On it, Sarge." "DeLuca, Washington, get this beast into the main repair bay. We're doing a full mechanical checkout and transmission swap." "You're actually going through with this?" DeLuca asked. "Can't test a theory without data, Corporal. And 66th Armoured needs tanks. We're giving them one." They pushed Sherman 2C12 into the depot's central repair bay, where it sat under bright overhead lights. In full daylight, the standoff cage looked even more bizarre than it had in darkness. Steel posts protruded from every angle, connected by horizontal bars in a dense gridwork. The effect was simultaneously protective and ridiculous. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison walked past at 1015 hours, stopped and stared. Kowalski? What in the hell is that? Damaged Sherman, sir. Transmission's shot, but we're swapping it out for the 66th Armoured Requisition. I can see it's a Sherman, Sergeant. I'm asking about the goddamn birdcage welded to it. Kowalski had prepared for this moment. His answer was technically true while omitting crucial details, a skill he'd perfected over 2 years of combat service. Some crews have been adding improvised armour, sir. Track links, spare plates, whatever they can scavenge. This crew went a different direction, standoff framework instead of added thickness. Harrison walked around the tank, examining the cage structure. I've never seen anything like this. Where'd they get the materials? Salvage yard, sir. Destroyed vehicles, scrap steel, nothing we couldn't spare. Does it actually work? Don't know, sir. Crew that installed it got killed before they could report results. We're just repairing the mechanical damage and sending it forward. This was technically true. The crew consisted of Kowalski and his 3 co-conspirators, and they hadn't been killed, but Harrison didn't need to know that the cage had been installed last night by depot personnel rather than by a frontline crew weeks ago. Harrison frowned, clearly suspicious, but unable to articulate exactly what was wrong. This wasn't built by combat crews, Kowalski. This is precision welding with carefully measured spacing. This was engineered. Some crews have pretty skilled welders, sir. Bullshit. This was built in a proper shop with time and planning. He paused, studying Kowalski's face. You built this, didn't you? Kowalski met his eyes. Sir, all I know is that we have a requisition for operational Shermans, and this one will be operational by 1400 hours. The 66th Armoured doesn't care what it looks like as long as it shoots straight and moves when they need it. Harrison's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to resignation. If this unauthorized modification causes any problems, if it interferes with tank operation, if it gets crews killed, if it creates any complications whatsoever, your ass is mine. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. And Kowalski? Next time you want to redesign army equipment, go through proper channels. We have procedures for a reason. Yes, sir. Harrison walked away, shaking his head. DeLuca emerged from under the tank, where he'd been removing transmission bolts. Think he'll shut us down? No. He's curious enough to want to see what happens, and we're solving his immediate problem. 66th Armoured needs tanks. Besides, by the time any official objection gets processed, we'll have combat data one way or another. The transmission swap went smoothly. Morrison located a suitable replacement from a Sherman that had taken a catastrophic engine-hit transmission intact, but the power plant was scrap. By 1300 hours, they had the new transmission installed, drive shafts connected, and fluids topped off. Kowalski climbed into the driver's position and fired up the engine. The Ford GAA V8 roared to life, 500 horsepower, shaking the steel hull. He worked through the gears, testing clutch engagement and shift quality. Everything felt solid. Mechanical checkout complete, he announced. Tank is operational. Now what? Morrison asked. Now we deliver it to 66th Armoured, and volunteer to crew it until they can assign a permanent crew. Washington whistled. You're really doing this. We built it. We test it. That was the deal. They spent the next hour conducting final checks, loading ammunition, and preparing the tank for combat operations. The standard Sherman loadout included 90 rounds of 75mm ammunition, armor-piercing, high-explosive, and white phosphorus. The bow machine gun received 4,500 rounds of 30-caliber ammunition. The commander's 50-caliber machine gun got 600 rounds. At 1,445 hours, Kowalski signed the transfer paperwork and received orders to deliver Sherman 2C-1 to 66th Armoured's position near Saint-Lô, approximately 8 miles from the depot. The 4-man crew mounted up. Kowalski drove. Washington took the bowgunner position. DeLuca became the loader. Morrison climbed into the turret as gunner. They were short a tank commander, but Kowalski figured he could handle driving and tactical command simultaneously. "Radio check," Kowalski said into the intercom. "Bow gunner, check," Washington responded. "Loader, check," DeLuca confirmed. "Gunner, check," Morrison added. "Sarge, I've never fired a 75mm gun before. Point it at Germans and pull the trigger, Private. How hard can it be?" They rolled out of the depot at 1,500 hours. The drive to St. Lo took them through relatively secure rear areas, supply dumps, artillery positions, and infantry rest areas. American forces controlled this ground completely, but German artillery occasionally dropped rounds on roads and intersections. The standoff cage attracted attention. GIs stared, officers pointed. A few soldiers laughed, apparently thinking someone had built an anti-grenade cage or bird protection system. One infantry lieutenant flagged them down. "Sergeant, what the hell is that?" "Experimental armor, sir." "Looks like you drove through a construction site and picked up scaffolding." "Yes, sir. Works a bit like that, actually." The lieutenant shook his head. "Good luck. You're going to need it looking like a circus attraction." By 1630 hours, they reached 66th, Armoured's position. The regiment was dug in along a ridge line overlooking St. Lo, preparing for the next phase of offensive operations. The area showed signs of heavy recent fighting, destroyed vehicles, churned earth, and fresh graves marked by helmets and rifles. Kowalski reported to Captain Miller, the battalion maintenance officer. "We've got your replacement, Sherman, sir. Tank 2, C-12, fully operational, delivered as requested." Miller glanced at the tank, did a double take, and walked around it slowly. "What in God's name is that?" "Standoff armor framework, sir. Designed to trigger shaped charges prematurely." "Designed by who? Where'd this come from?" "Repair depot fabrication, sir. Thought it might help with the Panzerfaust problem." Miller studied the cage structure. "Does it work?" "Don't know yet, sir. That's why we're here to test it." "Test it?" "Sergeant, this isn't a goddamn science experiment. This is combat." "Yes, sir, which is why we need to test it in actual combat conditions. We built it, we'll crew it. If it works, great. If not, we'll report that too." Miller was quiet for a moment. "You volunteering to take this thing into action?" "Yes, sir. Me and my crew. We know the tank, we know the modification, and we're willing to find out if it saves lives." "You understand that if you're wrong, you die." "Understood, sir." Miller shook his head, but Kowalski saw something like respect in his expression. "All right, I've got a combat patrol scheduled for 0600 tomorrow. Hedgerow clearing operation south of here. Lot of German infantry with Panzerfausts. Your experimental tank can take point. We'll see how it holds up." "Thank you, sir." "I'm probably sending you to die in a weird-looking tank." That night, Kowalski's crew made final preparations. They test-fired the weapons, checked ammunition storage, and went over emergency procedures. The atmosphere was tense but determined. "Any of you want to back out? Now's the time," Kowalski told them. "No shame in it. This wasn't part of your job description." "I'm good," Washington said. "Me too," Morrison agreed. DeLuca nodded. "Let's see if your crazy idea works, Sarge." They tried to sleep, but mostly lay awake, thinking about tomorrow. At 0530 hours on July 20th, 1944, they mounted up. Sherman 2 C-12 joined a column of 5 other tanks moving south toward known German positions. The mission was to clear hedgerows, engage any enemy infantry, and secure a road junction for follow-on forces. The perfect scenario to test the standoff cage. The column moved out at 0600, travelling slowly down narrow, dirt roads flanked by the infamous Normandy hedgerows. Visibility was terrible, dense vegetation blocked sightlines to mere yards. Perfect ambush country. Kowalski's Sherman took point position, 100 yards ahead of the rest of the column. If anyone was going to get hit by a Panzerfaust, it would be them. They advanced cautiously, watching for movement. The countryside appeared empty, but Kowalski knew better. German infantry were masters of camouflage and patient ambush tactics. At 0647, they reached a T-intersection where they needed to turn east. Kowalski slowed, scanning the hedgerows. Something felt wrong. Movement, right side, Morrison called from the turret. Then, everything happened at once. A German soldier rose from concealment 20 yards away, Panzerfaust on his shoulder. Kowalski saw him clearly young, scared, determined. The Panzerfaust fired with a whoosh of smoke and flame. Time seemed to slow. The shaped charge warhead streaked toward them, spinning slightly, trailing smoke. It was going to hit the right sponson, exactly where the cage framework was densest. Kowalski saw the impact. The warhead struck a vertical post 8 inches from the hull. The contact fuse triggered. The shaped charge detonated. Normally, a Panzerfaust explosion produced a sharp crack and a penetrating jet of superheated plasma. This explosion sounded the same, but the result was different. The plasma jet formed Kowalski, understood the physics even as it happened, but it formed in empty air, 10 inches from the Sherman's actual armor. The jet propagated forward, hit the tank hull, and deflected. The weakened plasma jet struck at an angle, lacking the energy to penetrate. It scored the armor, leaving a bright scar of melted steel, but didn't punch through. Inside the tank, the crew heard a loud bang and felt the impact, but no penetration, no molten metal spray, no fire. They were alive. "We're hit!" Washington shouted. "I know," Kowalski responded, "but we're okay. Keep moving." He gunned the engine, swinging the tank toward the German soldier, who had dropped the spent Panzerfaust and was running. Morrison tracked him with the bow machine gun and fired. The German went down. "Holy shit, it worked," DeLuca breathed. "One data point," Kowalski said, but his hands were shaking on the controls. "Let's see if we can collect more." They continued the patrol for 3 more hours. They encountered 2 more Panzerfaust teams. Both hits struck the standoff cage. Both times, the shaped charges detonated prematurely. Both times, the Sherman's armor stopped the weakened jets. 3 hits, 3 survivals, 0 penetrations. The cage was scorched and damaged, some posts bent or broken. But the tank remained operational, and the crew remained alive. When they returned to base at 1,100 hours, word had already spread. A Sherman had taken 3 Panzerfaust hits and survived. Captain Miller examined the damage personally. "Sergeant Kowalski, I don't know if you're a genius or just lucky, but whatever that cage is, it saved your lives today." "Yes, sir. How fast can we build more?" And just like that, everything changed. Within 72 hours, every tank in 66th Armored Regiment was getting a standoff cage installed. Within a week, other units were requesting the modification. Within a month, depot fabrication shops across France were mass-producing cage components. The modification became officially known as Improvised Standoff Armor, Type K, the K for Kowalski. Soldiers called it Kowalski cages, or just survival cages. By September 1944, over 60% of Shermans in France had some form of standoff protection installed. The Panzerfaust remained deadly, but now it faced tanks that wouldn't reliably die from a single hit. American tank losses to shaped charges dropped by approximately 40%. That translated to thousands of lives saved. Ted Nelson's stud welding had saved 50 million man-hours in naval construction. Frank Kowalski's standoff cage saved thousands of tank crews from burning death. Both men were just welders who saw a problem and fixed it. Neither waited for permission. Neither accepted that official channels knew best. Sometimes the best innovations come from people who refuse to accept that something can't be done, and sometimes idiotic ideas turn out to be genius.